Hi everyone, I'm Miranda and I'm one of the CAP for this year's Fast Forward. So for today's lecture, we're going to be focused on debating religion, or basically how it is that you can debate religion motions or what to do when you encounter some of these motions in the wild. So, just two caveats for today's lecture. The first is I'm not an expert on religion as a topic. These are just some recurring themes that I've noticed over the years in religion debates. So, basically, what you can get from this is just that this is my own expertise as a debater and not necessarily as someone who practices religion very devotedly or as someone who is interested in religion in an academic sense. What this means is that this debate is, or this lecture as a whole, is something that's very focused on the basics. If you're looking for something that's more in depth on the specifics of various religions, this lecture isn't for you. I won't be able to explain things such as the specific institutions of religion, the specific beliefs or value systems of different religions, but rather it's more to say that in a more generic sense, what are the pros of religion, what are the cons of religion, and how you can utilize it within debates. Okay, from that then, the main thing that we want to do first and foremost is just to define what exactly religion is. So this is just to clarify everything that we have from the get-go, just so that the rest of this lecture is a bit more clear. The first definition that we get comes from Merriam-Webster in that it's an organized system of religious attitudes, beliefs, and practices. So what we can get from this is that at the point where it's an organized system, obviously, oftentimes there's an institution that is generally being followed. So in a lot of debates, there's an assumption that it's about religion in an organized religious sense. And that is something that's often true insofar as you want to be able to explain things such as how individuals end up following those higher up than them in the ladder, how institutions are able to influence specific other institutions in various ways, such as, for example, the state. Secondarily, then, we also just want to note is that religion can also be defined as the religious beliefs, observances, and social practices found within a given cultural context. So, from this, religion isn't something that's just taken in isolation. It's something that influences culture, but is also influenced by culture in turn. So, what do we mean by this? When we talk about the fact that religion influences culture, this is something that happens in a lot of areas wherein there is one dominant religious community. So in the Philippines, for example, with over 80% of the Philippines being Roman Catholic, what this means is that even individuals who aren't Catholic are often exposed to the religious practices of Catholicism and often end up absorbing it in their own way. On the converse, however, this is also something that affects the religion in turn. Catholicism in the Philippines is obviously different from the Catholicism that is practiced in France, is practiced in the Vatican, etc., because of the ways that we've imbued it with our own cultural attributes. So, for example, things such as folk Catholicism have ended up evolving or ended up being developed as a result of this. Lastly, then, what we also need to note is that religion can be defined as a commitment or devotion to a god or gods, a system of beliefs, or religious observance, the service and worship of a god, of multiple gods, or of the supernatural. So the main keywords for this are just commitment or devotion, or also that of service and worship. Obviously, at the point in time where we're talking about religion, we need to discuss the ways in which people end up being affected by religion. It isn't necessarily just about people being a part of that religion because they're labeled as such or born as such, but it's specifically about the ways that people live through it on a day-to-day basis. Therefore, what we need to note from this is that while religion is not always theistic and it's not always organized and can also differ in the kinds of experiences that you have in the fact that it's individual or communal, the fact that it influences culture means that it comes in many different forms. A common mistake that we often make in the Philippine context or with us debaters, especially in high school, is that we assume that religion always takes the form of what is present in our immediate communities. So, for example, because the dominant religion in the Philippines is Christianity, regardless of whether or not it's Catholic, we often use a lot of examples that are related to this. This is something that, while can stand in terms of the way that the attributes can be generalized in a more abstract sense, you still need to be careful of, especially when you join debates that are more international in nature or have teams coming from other countries. So, especially when you have judges that might not come from the same background, this is something that can backfire from you. Obviously, this is something that isn't really the most pressing matter, but it's just something that you want to keep in mind in the way that you end up constructing the arguments that you have within debates. Okay, from this then, what are some questions that you want to consider when encountering religion motions? The first question that we want to ask is just how powerful are religious institutions? Before I go on further, I also just want to make a brief caveat that this isn't a list that is fully exhaustive. These are just some things that might be able to help you just try to construct or build your arguments to be a bit more clear. So, in terms of how powerful religious institutions are, the main reason as to why this is important is because the power of religious institutions also ends up dictating the influence that they're able to have. So, this influence is something that's important insofar as it's not just about the religious institution in isolation, but it's also about how they're able to affect other institutions, such as, for instance, the state, or it's also able to affect individuals under them, the likelihood as to which their followers end up following them. So, for example, if we talk about the power of religious institutions, one way that this can be discussed is in terms of their financial capabilities. How much money does this institution have? The reason as to why this is important is because this affects the way that they're able to do things such as build more congregations, affects how many missionaries they're able to send out. Insofar as these are things that require a huge degree of capital, you need to be able to explain that they have that capital in the first place and where is it that they get that from. Another way that they're also able to have power is in terms of their followers. If their followers are people who are very devoted to them and there's a large number of people who are included within that particular pool, that means that this religious institution can constitute an important voting bloc within the state, which means the state is more likely to follow through with what it is that they might want or might try to please them in a lot of different metrics. So, for example, because of the way that many people in the Philippines are Catholic, a lot of politicians within the Philippines try to market themselves in a way that is friendly towards that particular religion. Secondarily, then, another question that we need to ask is how does religion interact with people's lives? The reason for this is just to be able to give clear illustrations of what exactly religion means. We can't always assert, right, that religion matters in isolation, that religion matters just because of the fact that people identify as such. You need to be able to explain how is it that religion matters in a more practical sense. For example, do people end up going to church every week because of religion? Do people make friends of the same religion more than they make friends of other religions? Do people end up donating to charitable organizations because of religion? All these are ways that religion encourages people to act and therefore needs to be explained clear within the debate in order just for us to just get a clear picture of whether or not it's something that has led to good or has led to harm. Lastly, then, why do people believe in or engage with religion? So, before anything else, we also just want to be able to understand why is it that people stay within religion in the first place, or why is it that they're able to opt in. At the point where you explain it, it becomes a lot clearer as to how you might also, on the converse, might want to respond to or might want to explain the reasons as to why people opt out to begin with. So if you're able to explain that people believe in religion in the first place because they are able to do things such as get more of a sense of meaning, if you want to explain the converse that people opt out because they don't have enough of that meaning, you want to explain how people get it in other ways outside of religion. So while all of these are things that obviously you need to be able to prove as exclusive towards religion when you're having a lot of comparatives that might go against it, these are just some things that you want to just have in mind in how you end up constructing the way that you view debates. Some examples then before we go on to just being able to explain things more in depth. So these are some motions that have come out in the previous years or quite classic in nature as to how religion is ends up being used right now. So first motion is this house predicts that Abrahamic religions will be more decentralized over the next 10 years coming from Bali UADC. Second motion is this house regrets the centrality of repentance in organized religions from NDC Moraita. And lastly, it's this house believes that states should actively promote religion in areas with high poverty. So a more classic motion, basically. So, in terms of the examples, with the first on the decentralization of the Abrahamic religions, one of the first questions that you want to ask when you encounter a motion such as this is what might cause its decentralization in the first place? If you look back at the questions that we discussed earlier, you can also connect a few concepts, such as, for example, when we talk about the power of religious institutions, are these institutions gaining less power? Is that why it's causing its decentralization? Or if we talk about belief, are people believing in these institutions less, which means that they have less belief and therefore might end up being decentralized? All these are things that can influence how this motion is being built and therefore questions that you want to ask in conjunction to it. The second is this house regrets the centrality of repentance in organized religion. So, if we're talking about organized religion, you want to just try to explain how exactly organized religion works. And the reason for that is because being able to explain how organized religion works is the prerequisite to being able to explain how people are able to understand the centrality of repentance. Is it being pushed in a way that's particularly good or bad? And that's how you get the arguments that you have coming into this debate. Lastly, then, this house believes that states should actively promote religion in areas with high poverty. The main thing from this, though obviously you still need to prove why states are likely to do this in a good or bad way, right? So that goes on to more generic incentives. The main thing that you get when you enter into the religion part of this motion is just the explanation and how exactly people internalize religion in the first place. So, assuming that you're able to neutralize it, right? It doesn't really matter if states do this in a good or bad way. You want to explain that regardless, people internalize it in a way that is going to be more helpful or harmful for your side of the house. So that's the main reason as to why you want to get into the more psychological aspects of religion with this particular motion. Okay, based on all of that then, what exactly is it that we want to tackle for today? What we want to discuss is what does religion have to offer as a whole? And the main reason as to why we want to discuss what religion has to offer is because it allows us to get a better understanding of why is it that people believe in religion in the first place and why is it that they give enough power to institutions for it to control them. Okay, so four things that we want to tackle here then. What are the benefits of religion? While this isn't an exhaustive list again, these are just some ideas that you can get started with. The first is just on meaning, right? How exactly is religion able to give people meaning? How is it that it gives them a sense of purpose? The second is on community. How does religion help people get a sense of individuals who they're able to bond with closer in a way that other areas of their life might not? Third is morality. How does religion help people to construct their moral codes? How is it that it helps them to become better people? Lastly, then, innovation. How does religion push people to do more things? How does it push society further? Firstly, then, meaning. So, the main thing that we want to note from this is that there's often a consensus, right, that religion is able to give people meaning and a sense of purpose. This happens in a couple of different ways. Firstly is the concept of an afterlife. At the point in time where we aren't really able to be able to guarantee, right, that there is going to be something after we die, the way that religion works and being able to offer people options such as the idea of heaven or hell or the idea of rebirth is that it gives people a more permanent understanding of who they are in the grand scheme of things. When people have the notion that there is more to life beyond what is currently existing for them, there's less fear of eventually ending up dying, etc. Secondarily, then, it's also just the thought of higher being. When there's the concept of higher being who has created the universe as a whole, as is present within a lot of religions with gods or goddesses, the thought of them existing and therefore being able to help you in the current circumstances that you have is something that gives you a great degree of solace. This is in comparison to if there is no god or gods, what ends up happening is that people are left to deal with things on their own, which sometimes is difficult to deal with insofar as there is no backup sense of comfort that they're able to get. There is no safety net. Lastly, then, it's also just the idea that there is a point to life in the first place. Because of the way that a lot of religious systems have a set of values that you need to live up to in order to be able to get good outcomes, what this means is that you're working towards a particular goal. Because of the way that religion gives people a goal, the meaning of their lives then is centered on being able to reach that goal. The end result of this then is just overall, people are often very comforted by religion. This comfort is something that gives them a large degree of solace, is able to give them happiness in their lives, etc. The way that you can use this in debate is dependent on the debate that you're in. But generally, you want to be able to use this to just explain how, even internally, outside of more pragmatic benefits, religion is also something that's helpful. But particularly in the context of minorities or people who are disenfranchised, this is a unique benefit that they're able to get absent any material considerations. Secondly, then, community. How exactly is religion beneficial for you to be able to build a greater sense of community? While we want to note that this isn't something that is exclusive, in the status quo, religious communities tend to be larger and more close knit compared to secular communities. Obviously, in the context of the debate, you need to explain why this is the case, but reasons for this include the fact that currently in status quo, things such as third spaces are being destroyed right now, which means that people don't really have a lot of ability to create as close bonds with people in face-to-face settings as compared to before. So things such as, for example, parks where people were able to meet casually are things that happen on a less frequent basis today. Generally, then, religious communities are able to get together based on the following prongs. That one, there's largely a huge sense of shared values and beliefs. At the point where you believe in a singular God, you believe in a singular religion or faith, etc., oftentimes you believe in a certain list of things as being good or bad to do. When you're able to trust that the individuals around you believe in the same things as you do, oftentimes that is sort of social lubricant for you to be able to become closer to one another. Secondarily, then, there's also just a greater sense of responsibility. When you're in the same religion, oftentimes you have a responsibility towards that religion, to your faith, to be able to live up to its tenets. Outside of that, there's also often a responsibility towards your immediate community, such as your parish, your church, your constituency. You want to be able to help it grow, you want to be able to help it succeed. Therefore, oftentimes you work with others in close coordination in order to be able to achieve that particular goal. Lastly, it's also in terms of regular routines. You can talk about things such as going to church. When you go to church with another individual on a weekly basis, oftentimes that allows you to become more close because of more proximity over time in a way that you don't really have access to in other ways. People are made to carve out huge chunks of time in order to go to church on a weekly basis in comparison to scheduling regular things with their friends or family in many instances. The end result of this then is just that people often have access to a larger sense of community within the context of religion. So basically, you just want to use this to explain as to why people might inherently seek out religion for this benefit. But outside of that, you can also just explain that at the point in time where an individual opts out of the religion, even when it comes to belief, they also opt out of things such as a huge support system for them, a way that they're able to live through their day to day, knowing that there are people who care about them. Thirdly, then, we want to discuss morality as another benefit. So, outside of meaning and community, the way that religion helps you is just to be able to construct a huge sense of moral codes and beliefs, a sense of good and right for what it is that you should follow in your day to day. In terms of morality, one of the reasons as to why it's able to or why religion is able to help people be more moral is because of the way that they often promote moral codes that members are encouraged to follow. So at the point in time where you don't follow this moral code, oft it's viewed as you going against the religion. So what it's able to do is just to promote a sense of right and wrong. This isn't necessarily something that's objectively good and bad, right? But rather it's within the context of the religion, there's something that is viewed as moral and immoral. From this, there's also often associated rewards and punishments. So, in a lot of Abrahamic religions, there's the concept of there being heaven or hell. Or outside of that, there's also often the concept of there being rebirth. Even rebirth is not something that happens without consequences because at the point in time where you do things that are bad and you accrue a lot of bad karma, what ends up happening is that you're more likely to be born as a lesser creature. You're likely to be born as an insect in your next life as opposed to a human. So, what this means is that because your next life is at stake, or because whatever it is that you're able to achieve in a good sense, or the ways that you're able to have a good outcome at the end are threatened by whether or not you follow that moral code, people often end up being more encouraged to do this in a way that is forceful on them. So the caveat for this as to how people end up developing morality is that obviously this is something that's also possible outside of religion. But it's important to explain how this can come from external considerations if you want to talk about it in that sense. So things such as, for example, education, etc., as something that can lead to you becoming more moral, you also need to explain as to why that's a good alternative compared to the morality that religion offers, given that other arguments you can make from this are just the fact that oftentimes people are raised within a religion, therefore it's something that they have more exposure to from the time that they're young. Lastly, then, on innovation. How exactly does religion help people just to innovate? So this is something that's important because I think one of the misconceptions with religion is that it's something that's anti-innovation, right? It's something that's anti-science. However, what we need to note is that historically, that's not actually the case. Religion has been able to spearhead a lot of innovations throughout history. On net, it hasn't always been anti-science. So, for example, a lot of more historical examples are with medieval technology in the Middle Ages, wherein religious institutions, because of their power, because of the degree to which people believed in it, were often the only institutions that were able to really stand against the threat of the monarchy. So, for instance, these schools were the only access to education that was possible because monarchs generally had the incentive to keep people in the dark. Insofar as people were kept in the dark, these were individuals who were just easier to control. So it was an important counter mechanism that was needed to just fight back against the tyranny of the kings and queens at the time. But outside of that, it's also not necessarily about how religion counters other institutions, but it's also about the internal incentives that people have as a result of religion. So, with the Islamic Golden Age, what Islam was able to do was that it pushed people to seek knowledge and led to advancements in math, science, and medicine, independent of trying to fight other actors because of the way that the religion itself espoused that. So, over time, we can just see that there's a lot of ways that religion has helped innovation. It's helped to make people work towards those specific goals. Obviously, in the context of today, this is something that has ended up decreasing over time insofar as there's other incentives to innovate. But if we're talking about motions wherein you would prefer a world without religion, etc., these are ways that you can just try to argue against it, given the fact that religion as a whole, because of the degree of capital it's had, but also the influence has it's had, has been able to just help in this particular avenue. Okay, so given that we've discussed the pros of religion then or the benefits of it, the next thing that we want to discuss, if for example you're arguing in motions wherein you want less people to be religious or you would prefer a world without religion, is just the specific reasons as to why religion itself has been quite harmful over time. So there are four things that we want to consider. Firstly, it's on dogma. The fact is that with religion, because of the way that a lot of organized religion specifically, it's been hierarchical, the way that it's evolved has been quite slow in nature. It's often been very stagnant and not really representative of people's current opinions. Secondarily, it's also in terms of conflict. Because of the way that we give this benefit, right, of religion generally leading to you having a sense of community, in a lot of history, the sense of community has led to a strong us versus them narrative. This narrative of there being the insider versus the outsider. And what this has meant is that there's been violence against these outsiders, there's been conflict against other groups or between groups as a whole. Third, there's also fear. If there's a system of rewards and punishments, then obviously there's also sometimes fear, there's associated shame and guilt from feeling as though you're one of the types of people who might end up accruing those sorts of punishments over time. Lastly, then, it's also exploitation. The structure of religion is not necessarily exploitative in nature, but the fact is that it can often be used in such ways because it is something that's particularly vulnerable to that form of abuse. Moving on to the first 10, on dogma. The reason as to why religion can be harmful in this sense is because people are often forced to follow a strict set of rules that may or may not be coherent with the times, or may also not be coherent with what it is that they agree with. So, given the fact that religion is often something that comes from top down, so for example, there's something that's said to be the word of God, or it's something that's said to be interpreted by the Pope specifically, or higher beings within the church who are not necessarily answerable to you, there's often a huge degree to which it constrains individual autonomy. If you believe in something that is separate from what the church believes, it's viewed as you being the person who is in the wrong, as opposed to there being actual dialogue as to what is actually the right option. You are immediately wrong. Whoever's in charge is automatically right. But secondarily, then, the reason as to why this is particularly harmful is because a lot of problematic narratives and stances have carried over from the past until the present day. Because religion has evolved very slowly over time, what this means is that there's a lot of beliefs that don't necessarily hold up in the same way that they did before. So, if, for example, we look at the beliefs on premarital sex or homosexuality, these are things that were heavily criticized by the church in the past and still continue to be pushed as bad today, despite it being generally more accepted within society right now. What we need to note from this, however, is that even though religions are dogmatic, there is still the potential of reform. Religions can evolve, and is something that can happen both internally and externally. So, when there are enough people within the church who feel as though the religion isn't representative of them, even though their higher ups say that this is something that is true and is still good, there can be an internal push within people within the religion by certain sects to be able to change that dogma. While it takes time, this is something that is possible. Or even outside of that, when the world changes enough, such as through the forces of modernization, it means that the church or other religious institutions are often forced to adapt. The problem with how religion can evolve, however, is that this is often slow. Because of the way that we explain that religions are hierarchical, what this means is that it's often difficult to question the word of higher power or someone presenting themselves as its representative. It's often viewed as a threat or an insult to the religion itself if you speak up. Therefore, a lot of people often self select out of it entirely, they stay silent. But outside of that, it's also the selfish incentives that individuals have, right? If you're someone who's trying to move up throughout the church, if you're someone who wants to be promoted, you want to stay silent in order to be able to get that promotion faster and to be viewed as a good follower. Or if you're just an average follower, you want to present yourself as good in order to be able to ensure that you have the highest chance of getting to heaven. So, what this means is that even though people might want to question, they generally don't question as much as they should. Therefore, in a lot of debates, the progress that you want to get is more on on very small extents as opposed to being able to argue that it happens immediately in wide scale. Okay, so that's on dogma, right? Secondarily, then, conflict. What exactly are the specific cons that come off of religion when it comes to conflict? Throughout history, what we want to note is that religion has generally led to a lot of conflicts that have happened both within the religion internally, but also outside of the religion. So, within the religion, this looks like schisms and divisions. At the point where there are disagreements as to how a religion should be interpreted, a lot of religions have instead divided. So, there are a lot of sects. So, for example, within Islam, there's Shia and Sunni Islam, but also with, for example, Christianity, we see that there are Protestants, there are Catholics, etc. All of these have had a lot of divisions and fights over time because of the belief that they were the only true form of that particular religion. But outside of that, there's also a huge degree of interreligious conflict and sacred violence. At the point wherein the religion itself feels as though they are the only religion that has the validity to exist and is the only religion that is right and therefore others should believe in it as well, there has been the case of people fighting and suppressing outside groups or suppressing other religions in order to be able to push their own sense of it, or outside of that, also just having a huge degree of violence in order to engage with mass conversion. So if we look at the at what the Spanish did to the Philippines in terms of trying to push the idea of Catholicism, that's a degree of conflict that resulted from the Catholic Church as a whole. So, what we want to note is that the primary reason as to why all of this conflict exists is because of the fact that many religions are exclusive in nature. There's a strong sense of us versus them, a strong sense of the insider and outsider, as discussed. So, the end result of it is oftentimes it results in the sidelining of minorities. People are unable to speak up about things that they might want to change. So, this degree of conflict is also another reason as to why, even within the religion itself, people might not want to have that incentive to change because they want to avoid the conflict that might end up resulting as in the aftermath. Thirdly, then, fear. So, for when it comes to conflict, right, it's something that's more externally noticed. But with fear, it's more of an internal experience. So, if we want to flip this idea that people are able to get solace from religion, from there being, for example, this idea of meaning, this meaning is something that can be interpreted differently. What do I mean by this? So, when it comes to fear, right, a lot of religions have a system of rewards and punishments. What this means is the way that it's being pushed can lead to people internalizing a lot of harmful narratives, can lead to people behaving in good ways, not necessarily because they want to, but because they're constantly afraid of facing the consequences of their actions. So, what this means is that, for example, if you're part of a community that has been historically marginalized under the church, such as people who are queer, there's often a large fear of going to hell because you've always been told that homosexuality is a sin. Or when it comes to how you might do things just because you're scared of the consequences of your actions, Even though it might lead to good outcomes, it ends up affecting your own mentality. It ends up affecting the way that you might see your own part within that religion and your own way of constructing whether or not the way that you're living is currently good or bad right now. So basically, it's just to say that the fear that religion might offer within this paradigm is something that might also lead to you just not really being able to benefit a lot from religion in terms of your own internal calculus. You're always going to be afraid. You're never going to be fully happy within that state. Lastly, then, we also just want to discuss exploitation real quick. So, exploitation, again, this isn't something that is inherent to religion, but it is something that is particularly common in religion for the primary reason that religion is a tool that is often used to justify abuse by authorities. So, an example of this is child abuse in the Catholic Church. When abuse was rampant, one of the reasons as to why people were told to stay silent and they agreed to that was because they thought that if they went against the priests, they would be threatening their own ability to get into heaven. They thought they were threatening their own ability to be good people. So, this huge leverage that higher ups within churches or religious institutions have of holding your access to the afterlife or holding your access to karma or other good things is something that often leads to people behaving in ways that aren't beneficial to them because they feel as though they are coerced into taking these actions at the threat of losing whatever it is that they want. So this is something that can take a lot of forms, right? It can be financial, physical, emotional, or psychological. Oftentimes, a lot of cults also end up using similar tactics. So ways that this manifests is if, for example, there's tithes that are required by your church. Sometimes when churches are coercive enough, they end up saying that you won't be able to go to heaven if you don't give that amount, even though you're someone who's incredibly poor. So, in the cases where this happens, and sometimes this also is corrupted in terms of the embezzlement within the church, they pocket this own money. None of the benefit goes towards followers, all of the benefit goes towards these authorities, which is why exploitation is as rampant as it is. All this are just the benefits and the cons that we explain, right? So that's it for what exactly we can get from religion, what it has to offer as a whole. From this then, let's have one example before we end the lecture. Let's try this motion that we saw earlier. This house believes that states should actively promote religion in areas with high poverty. How do we think the benefits of religion can be used within this motion? So going back, we talked about meaning, we talked about community, we talked about morality and innovation. When it comes to areas with high poverty, then, why should states actively promote religion? So there's a couple of ways that we can view this motion on government. For example, if we're talking about meaning, right, we can argue that the reason as to why religion is important in these areas is because it provides these individuals with hope for a better future. The reason for that is because within their current lives, right, if you're someone who's poor, your current life isn't something that is particularly good. You don't really have a lot of guarantee that your material conditions will ever get any better. In comparison to if religion is promoted and religion says that people who act well will be able to go to heaven, people who are good will eventually get their comeuppance, they'll eventually be able to get out of poverty. It provides them with more of an ability to look toward that future with goodwill as opposed to immediately dreading it all time after time again. So that's one reason as to why it might provide these people meaning. If we want to look at community, at the point where religions are being promoted, they do things such as structure churches within that area. So if these are churches that you're able to go to week after week again, you have more people to share your struggles with. Another way that this community can help is also through charitable actions. Since a lot of religions have charitable arms, it means that you have more access to these things, and that might be a reason as to why, in a communal sense, a religion might be something that's good. With morality, if the argument is that in these areas with high poverty, there might also be high rates of crime because of desperation over resources. One way that you might want to reduce this crime is through providing people with a stronger moral code, which is something that can be argued for here. Lastly, then, with innovation, it's also just this idea that there might be more incentive to escape poverty because of the fact that there's more within these religions, sometimes there's things that are being pushed, such as the value of hard work. It pushes these alternative values as something that is important to constantly work at time after time again. Obviously, the degree to which any of these can be argued is also reliant on the degree to which you're able to prove that this is poverty that can be escaped, given that oftentimes there's also a lot of structural barriers that stand against people being able to get out of those situations in the first place. But given that, you can also just weigh some of these against one another, right? At the very least, the arguments on meaning is something that is some you can achieve regardless of the material considerations that you're able to change. Therefore, it might be something that's the most important within the debate. So obviously, you still need to build all of these, but these are some directions that you can go to based on the benefits. On opposition, then, what are the cons of religion? Again, we discussed it in terms of dogma, conflict, fear, and exploitation. How do we apply this to the motion? Couple of ways. So, if the argument is just that states shouldn't actively promote religion in areas with high poverty because of XYZ reasons, here are a few. In terms of dogma, it can be about the way that religion doesn't consider their circumstances. So, if, for example, there is a particular religion that promotes being poor as something that is of their own moral failing, it could be something that leads to these people feeling more guilt over time, and therefore shouldn't be something that is pushed because of the way that hasn't evolved to really be in conjunction or with their needs. With conflict, on the other hand, if there are a lot of different subsets of people within this area, it can also cause a greater degree of infighting, which is something that might not be needed at this point in time. When it comes to fear, you can talk about the fact that you don't want to cause more stress for these individuals. If, for example, this is a religion that promotes actions just tithing, or promotes just the fact that uh actions that aren't really accessible to them in order to be able to get into heaven or to be able to be viewed as a good person, because of their feeling at the point where they entered this religion that they're not enough, this might result in them feeling more shame, more guilt, and more fear, and therefore something that you shouldn't put on their heads. Lastly, then, in terms of exploitation, it's the fact that in these areas with high poverty, these individuals are often the most vulnerable. So you don't want to subject them to more areas wherein their vulnerability might be taken advantage of, especially when they already have so little to give. So those are just some arguments that you might want to push on opposition again. So overall, these are just some ideas on religion motions, on what exactly you can argue on gov, on op, in terms of its pros and cons. Obviously, you still need to nuance it towards any particular debate, but overall, I just hope that this helped you guys in some way or form. So by this, thank you again for listening, and this is the end of my lecture for today. Good luck with fast forward, everyone, for those who are going, and for those who are just watching this for fun. Hope you got something out of it.